Technical difficulties. Unlike all the other speakers you've heard from this morning, I'm a Macintosh user, and so my PowerPoint show was beautiful. It blew everybody else's out of the water, and unfortunately my Macintosh died yesterday, and so you aren't going to get to see it. So I'm just going to go from a few notes and try to tell you what the show was going to show you, and frankly, you know, these pictures are just a crutch anyway. A lot of you, I sent out an email before the conference saying that the airport is connected to the hotel by MARTA, and I recommend taking the train in so you get the experience of learning what the train was like, and a lot of people did, and they told me it was a pretty good experience. And in fact, I did too. I took the train at 12:15 in the morning and got here about 1 o'clock in the morning, and wasn't too bad. I didn't get to see any of the scenery, unfortunately. One of the points that I wanted to make, however, was that MARTA, they started construction in the late 70s. I believe the first line opened in 1979. They've continually expanded it over the years. They've added more miles every few years. Ever since then, ridership peaked in 1985. It shrank steadily after 1985, and then it peaked again for the Olympics in 1998. Is that the Olympics? 96 for the Olympics, and then it went down up again in 1998, and then since then it's been going down steadily. Right now it is lower today than it was in 1985. So 1985 there were about 40 miles of rail, now there's about 100 miles of rail, and yet total ridership is lower. So this just illustrates the kind of problem that Ted was telling you about. Atlanta decided to sink a lot of money into rail transit for choice riders, and they ended up losing a lot of transit-dependent people because it's so costly. They had to cut back on other services. And interestingly, the population has doubled in that time. The population of the region has doubled, and yet we still have fewer transit riders total, not just fewer per capita. And there's some would say, well, that's because they didn't complete the system. They only built it in, what, 3 of the 5 counties. And so it would have been nicer to have a system that was more complete, had more miles of road, cost more billions of dollars. But look around the country, and where would you find a complete system with lots of rail going everywhere? Well, one place is Chicago. Between 1990 and 2000, Chicago's population, the Chicago metropolitan area, grew by about 500,000 people. They gained about 300,000 new workers. Every single one of those workers commuted to work by car. Every single one of them. And 50,000 people who were commuting to work by transit in 1990 switched to the automobile by 2000. 50,000. They lost 50,000 transit commuters. Transit ridership steadily and dramatically declined between 1990 and 2000 in Chicago. All of the decline was in the bus riders because, again, the cost of maintaining the rail was so high, even though the rails were already there. A lot of commuter rail, the rails were already there, but the cost was so high of keeping it going that they cut back on bus service. Jobs suburbanized as people tried to get away from the congestion, and the buses don't serve the suburban jobs, so ridership declined. What about a place where we have spent $10 billion on rail transit? I believe that's twice as much as Atlanta spent after adjusting for inflation. A huge amount of money on rail transit. Washington, D.C. You've all been to Washington, I'm sure. You've ridden those trains. They're great if you're a visitor. But guess what? Between 1990 and 2000, Washington gained 113,000 new commuters. Every single one of those commuters drove to work, virtually. And in the meantime, 22,000 people who were taking transit to work in 1990 switched to driving by the year 2000. Same thing. They got a great train system. They can't afford to maintain it. Their elevators break down. Their escalators break down. They said they're woefully lacking in the money it needs to keep it going. And as a result, they're cannibalizing their bus system and they're losing out. Now, this is a story that we've been telling for several years. Tom Rubin, Wendell Cox, Ted Balaker, and I, and other people, we've been telling this story, and there's a group that's emerged out of Victoria, British Columbia, of all places. It's called the Victoria Transportation Policy Institute. And they are essentially an anti-Cox, Rubin, Balaker, O'Toole. They're the transit industry's antidote to us. A fellow there named Todd Littman, who as far as I know is the Victoria Transportation Policy Institute, and I have a confession to make, the Thoreau Institute is me, so I'm not really trying to say anything that there's anything wrong with that. He recently put out an article saying, light rail has reduced congestion. How do we know? Well, we look at the Texas Transportation Institute data. In Baltimore, for example, in the years before they opened the light rail line, congestion was growing at such and such a level. Then they opened the light rail line, and congestion, after that, according to the Texas Transportation Institute, congestion was growing at a slower rate. So that proves that light rail reduced congestion. Well, if I'd had my PowerPoint show, I'd have a beautiful graph to show you that shows that after they opened the light rail line, total transit ridership declined. So how does that reduce congestion? He has another statistic for St. Louis. Before they opened the light rail line, congestion was growing at 0.86% per year. Can you remember that? 0.86, 86? After they opened the light rail line, congestion was growing at 0.83% per year. 0.03% less after than before. So that proves that light rail reduced congestion. Well, frankly, nobody who knows the Texas Transportation Institute data thinks that the data are accurate to within 0.03%. And so there's no way that we can say that that proves that light rail reduced congestion. When you look at when you get the chance to look at my beautiful graph, which is actually in the publication Rail Disasters 2005, which is on your CD, and it's also in an Excel file called Rail 2000, or I think it's Rail 82 to 2004 data. You can look at the data, you can look at the graph. It shows that St. Louis opened their first light rail line in about 1990. And in about 2001, they doubled it. They added a new line. It doubled the length, doubled the entire light rail system. Total light rail ridership increased 0. They got no new light rail riders. Bus riders declined. Light rail riders, 0, no new riders when they doubled the system. That hardly indicates that light rail is reducing congestion. Okay, if rail is so bad, then why do so many people want it? Why are we seeing proposals in Raleigh and Albuquerque and Las Vegas and cities all over the country who don't have rail yet? They all want to join the world-class cities like Houston that have rail transit. Well, in order to understand this, we have to look and see how the federal government funds transit. In the 1970s, transit was funded out of general tax revenues. And transit agencies were busy buying new bus fleets with the grants that they could get from the federal government. But there was a curious thing. The grants were they'd give you a grant to buy a big bus or a little bus. And so a lot of transit agencies bought big buses, figuring, well, sometime they're going to be full. Most of the time they're going to run around empty, but they cost about the same to operate because the cost of operation is mainly the driver, and it costs one driver to operate a big bus as the same one driver as a little bus. It turns out that's not true at all, but that's the way they reason. Turns out the cost of operating a big bus is a lot more than the cost of operating a little bus, because it's more than just the driver. You've got to maintain the bus, and so big buses are more complicated to maintain, and so on. But they reasoned that way, so they all bought big buses. We've got these gigantic buses running around. They can't, on the tour yesterday, we learned big buses can't handle traffic calm streets very well. They are empty a lot of the time. And the latest thing, of course, is to put transit advertising on the windows so you can't see in and see how empty the buses are all the time. Well, then the city of Boston said, we don't want to build any more roads. And actually it was Governor Sargent of Massachusetts said, we don't want to build any more roads in Boston. We've got all these approved highways that the federal government is willing to fund, but we don't want to build them. We just want to stop building roads in Boston. That's why only 9% of the money in Boston is going to roads. And so they went to Congress and said, we want the option of canceling an urban interstate freeway and dedicating the money to transit instead. So after a while, Congress said yes, and Boston was the first city to take advantage of it, and Portland was the second. As I believe it was Tom mentioned, Portland's mayor canceled an urban interstate freeway and decided to build a light rail line. Well, why light rail? The answer is simple. If you can take that money that was going to build a 4-lane freeway, which is kind of expensive, it was about $130 million, and spend it on transit instead, what can you do with buses? And you can only spend it on capital improvements. You can't spend it on operating costs. Well, you can buy hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of buses for $130 million, roughly 400 buses. And that's at today's prices. Probably in those days, it was 800 buses. So, but they didn't have enough money to operate 800 more buses. So they just had dead buses sitting there doing nothing. They couldn't do that. So what can we do that costs a lot of money to build but doesn't cost much to operate? Well, light rail costs a lot to build, but it doesn't cost much to operate. Actually, it turns out it does cost more than a bus to operate, but it's only one light rail line, so we can afford to operate that one light rail line and then pay the slightly extra cost of running it over the bus. But we get to spend all this money, and guess what? Once you start spending that money, then you create a constituency. You create contractors and bond dealers and electrical unions and so on and so forth, real estate brokers who are all interested now in supporting more rail construction. Well, in 1981, Congress repealed that law. But they instead said, we're not going to take a share of gas tax money and spend it on transit. Highway money, in 1956, when the Interstate Highway Act was passed, they had a strict formula for how the money would be distributed. Senator Isaacson referred to this formula this morning. The formula said it's based on the population and the land area and the number of miles of roads in each state. And so you know how much money you're going to get. If you're Georgia, you're going to get this amount of money every year. And every 6 years, Congress has this big debate. The donor states complain, the recipient states resist any changes, because some states do get a little more money than they put in, and some states do get a little less. But Congress has only interfered with the highway decisions pretty much as far as debating that formula. The bridge to nowhere, that wasn't more money to be spent in Alaska. It was dedicating the money that Alaska was going to get on that bridge. And Alaska may still build the bridge, even though that bridge to nowhere was taken out of the earmarks. So each state knew how much they were going to get. They had an incentive to spend it more or less efficiently. But when they created the transit program, particularly the New Starts program, they had no formula, which means they did have a formula. And that formula was the firstest with the mostest. If you came in with $1 billion proposal, you would get a substantial fraction of that $1 billion. If you came in with $1 million proposal, you'd get a substantial fraction of that $1 million. Well, which would you rather do? Well, if you're just interested in the money, and if you're interested in the jobs and more important, the political payoff from the companies who are going to donate money to your campaign because you're making them rich building a rail transit line, you're going to go for the $1 billion proposal. So Portland jumped on the bandwagon early. It was already on the bandwagon. Sacramento, a few other cities jumped on, and pretty soon all these other cities are looking around and saying, we're losing money because we're not getting our share. We're losing money to those other cities. Tom Rubin showed me an email he got yesterday morning, or 2 days ago morning. It was from somebody in Washington, D.C. They said, we've got a rail proposal. It's going to cost $1.8 billion. Half of it's going to be funded by the federal government, $900 million. We want to come in with an alternative proposal using bus rapid transit. But it's not going to cost anywhere near as much, and we're going to be accused of losing a substantial portion of that $900 million because we've got a cheaper proposal. It's going to save local taxpayers a substantial portion of that $100 million, but we're still going to be accused of losing that money. That's the kind of incentives that are going on. So to reform public transit, we're going to have to do a lot of things, but one thing that we absolutely have to do, in the next transportation reauthorization bill, we have to have a strict formula for all transit, federal transit money. That formula has to be based on something like the transit ridership in that urban area and the population of that urban area, maybe some other factors, but transit ridership has to be key, because if a city comes in and says, we're going to build a rail transit line and ridership's going to decline, that means you're going to lose money. Your federal match is going to start to decline because your ridership is going down. So that'll give transit agencies incentives to figure out cost-effective ways to improve transit ridership rather than figuring out expensive ways of capturing a few choice riders out of their automobiles. So that, to me, is the #1 goal for transit reform in the next 4 years on the federal level, is changing that part of the federal law, having a strict formula for distribution of federal transit funds. Thank you very much.